So let's start with the naming of President Putin back in 1999. What was the expectation when he steps up, and even earlier than that? Why Putin?
Well, of course, the biggest and the initial reaction when people heard of his name being announced as acting prime minister on the 9th of August of 1999 by President Yeltsin, the first reaction was, who is that? Most people had never heard of this guy. He was an obscure KGB official who rose from being deputy mayor of St. Petersburg in the 90s to being deputy chief of staff of the Kremlin and then director of the FSB, the Federal Security Service, the main domestic successor to the KGB. And from this position, he went on to become acting prime minister of Russia in August of 99. And then Parliament quickly confirmed him because nobody thought much of this. If you recall, 98 and 99, we had a succession of 4 or 5 prime ministers within several months. So this was considered a temp job at the time, prime minister of Russia. So nobody paid much attention. I remember this well. The summer of 99, everybody was consumed with the upcoming parliamentary election, which was scheduled for December and took place in December of 1999. By the way, this was the last national parliamentary election in Russia that was assessed by European and international monitors as free and fair and as conforming to democratic standards. So for the past almost 18 years, we've not had a free and fair national election in our country, just as an aside. But at the time, everybody was consumed with the election, and nobody really paid attention to some guy who was made prime minister, as many people thought this is only going to be for a few weeks or a few months, just like the others. Now, of course, here we are 18 years on, and the man is still in power. He's now approaching the record of Leonid Brezhnev, one of the longest-serving leaders of the Soviet Union. It was in many ways a symbol of Soviet totalitarian stagnation. Brezhnev's been in power for 18 years, and as of this August, or to be more precise, as of December of 2017, Vladimir Putin will have been in power for 18 years. And there's now an entire generation of Russians who have grown up not knowing any other political reality, who only have a memory of Putin in power. And in fact, the people, young Russians who will turn 18, who will become voters, and who will come to vote for the first time in March of 2018 for the presidential election, or the so-called presidential election, I should say, these people will have been born under Vladimir Putin. This is how long he's been in power. But of course, back in 99, I don't think anybody thought that this is how long it would take. Most people, even people who were interested in politics and would follow politics closely, would have no idea who this guy was. I mean, some people knew him in St. Petersburg from his days as deputy mayor there. Some people knew him from his days as director of the FSB. But again, he was somebody who was never prominent in politics, who's never run for elected office in his life. Let's remember this: the first election Vladimir Putin ran for in his life was election for president of Russia. He's never run for parliament, he's never run for regional legislature, for regional governor, nothing. He had no political experience at all.
What had he done to distinguish himself? Anything in that period of when he's the prime minister and then the anointed candidate of Boris Yeltsin?
Well, this was, of course, a very short time, just from August to December. And that time was marked by a complete political shift in Russia of that time. A political shift, of course, caused and spearheaded by the second war in Chechnya, which Mr. Putin was the author and the initiator of. And just a few weeks, really, after he became prime minister, we had a very suspicious slate of apartment bombings across Russia. In Moscow, in Buynaksk, in Volgodonsk, apartment buildings who were blown up, supposedly by Chechen terrorists. This was what was officially announced as the reason for those terrorist attacks. Hundreds of people were killed, innocent people, civilians, just sleeping in their homes. And this, of course, led to a public backlash, understandably, against the supposed perpetrators of these terrorist attacks. And this created the conditions in the political space for the Putin government to go into Chechnya and begin a second military campaign there. Of course, there was the original war in Chechnya took place from 1994 to 1996, ended with a truce, and then finally with a peace agreement in 1997. And so when Mr. Putin came to power as Prime Minister of Russia in the summer of 1999, there hadn't been war in Chechnya for more than 3 years already, but he restarted it. He sent troops again. He began a bombing campaign. And in these kind of conditions of this mass war hysteria, of this big scare, I mean, again, understandable when you have houses, apartment buildings being blown up randomly in the middle of the night across the country. All of this created the conditions for somebody who was basically completely unknown, and the party, which was just created literally a few weeks before the election was announced, just kind of, thrown from different pieces. It was called Unity. It's now United Russia, the ruling party that is led by Vladimir Putin. Within a space of a few weeks, he went from being a nobody to winning that parliamentary election, his party winning the parliamentary election in December of 1999, on the back of the military campaign in Chechnya, on the back of this mass hysteria and kind of the demand that the government do something, and he appeared to be doing something. And so he won the parliamentary election in December, and then, of course, as we all know, on New Year's Eve, on December 31st, 1999, President Yeltsin made the surprise announcement that he was resigning, stepping down, and Putin took over as acting president of Russia initially, and then in March of 2000 he won the presidential election. I mean, that was by no means a flawless election, by the way. It's always also important to remember this. There were credible reports at the time of ballot stuffing and rewriting of vote tallies in several regions, so there were strong doubts as to whether Mr. Putin actually secured the necessary 50% of the vote to win in the first round of the 2000 presidential election, but that was the last thing we had that was at least close to a competitive election in Russia. This was March 2000, the presidential election. As we just talked about parliamentary elections, this is exactly the same case with presidential. After 2000, not a single national election in Russia, parliamentary or presidential, has been assessed by international monitors as free and fair and conforming to democratic standards.
When you watched, did you watch the Yeltsin statement? Can you take me back there for a moment? What was that? Was it a surprise? What was it like for you?
It was, of course, a surprise. It was very sad as well, because, I'm from the generation whose first really vivid and really conscious political memory was August 91, the democratic revolution in Russia. Those 3 days that ended the Soviet regime and that, revolutionized our country in so many ways. And I remember those 3 days in August very well, though I was only 10 years old at the time. When something like this is happening in your country, you notice and you remember. And I think the lesson that I took from those events, and that I know I'll have for the rest of my life, is that however strong the dictatorship and the repression, if enough dedicated people are prepared to stand their ground and stand up for their liberty and their rights and their dignity, they will prevail. As we saw in August 91, the plotters of that attempted coup, the leadership of the Soviet Communist Party and the KGB, had everything. I mean, they were the state. They had the whole apparatus, the whole machine of repression, the whole machine of propaganda. The KGB, the police, the army, the tanks. Of course, they had the tanks, which they sent physically to occupy the center of Moscow. And the people, Russians, Muscovites, who stood up against that coup, had nothing except their dignity and their determination to defend their rights and their freedoms. And they went out and stood in the streets of Moscow in front of the tanks for 3 days and 3 nights. And the tanks stopped and turned away. That's a very powerful lesson. And Boris Yeltsin was a key figure in that. He was a hero of that democratic revolution, no questions about it. He was the one who stood on top of that tank as a symbol, as a powerful symbol of the resistance against those plotters, against that coup. And he, of course, led Russia for a very difficult, very tumultuous period, the 1990s. Of course, we had many economic difficulties. We had many problems in the Caucasus. We had many problems with the whole reformation of the state, and a lot of people experienced a lot of hardships in the 1990s under that government. But also, it was under Boris Yeltsin that we had genuine independent media in Russia, that we had free, democratic and competitive elections in Russia, both parliamentary and presidential, that we had strong regionals, we had real federalism, we had real pluralism. This was one of the very few periods in Russian history when we had democracy and political freedom. And so Boris Yeltsin, for all his shortcomings and all his mistakes, he was an absolutely historic figure in Russian history, and I think history will remember him very kindly, much kinder than people at the time thought of him. And so I remember this was a very sad moment when he resigned, and of course nobody really knew what was coming next, because as we just discussed with you, nobody really knew who this guy was. I mean, of course, you remember at the beginning of 2000, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Trudy Rubin of Philadelphia Inquirer asked her famous question to a panel of Russian politicians and experts, "Who is Mr. Putin?" And then there was a pause, silence in the room for a few seconds, and then everybody started laughing because nobody knew who this guy was. Here he was, the head of state of the largest country in the world, one of the two largest nuclear powers in the world, a member of the G8, member of the United Nations Security Council, and nobody knew who this guy was. Of course, we know now very well. And I must say, for those who were willing to see, and for those who were willing to notice, there were signs at the time of who this guy will be. I'll give you an example. I actually remember the day when I realized who Vladimir Putin was. This was December the 20th, 1999. It was 11 days before he would become acting president. He was still prime minister. Boris Yeltsin was still president. And that day, Mr. Putin did two things. Now, of course, December the 20th is the Chekist Day, the day of the founding of the Cheka, the KGB, the Soviet secret police. Still, by the way, astonishingly, it's still officially commemorated in Russia today. And so on that day, he went and unveiled a memorial plaque to his mentor, Yuri Andropov, on the KGB headquarters in Moscow, on the Lubyanka Square. Now, of course, Yuri Andropov was a longtime chairman of the Soviet KGB, infamous for having set up the Fifth Directorate, which was a special directorate within the KGB tasked with suppressing political dissent. So it was going after dissidents in the Soviet Union. He was also infamous for setting up the practice of punitive psychiatry. This is when dissidents were declared mentally insane and committed to psychiatric hospitals. So if you're against the Soviet regime, you were declared to be insane. This is what Andropov did. And so on December the 20th, 1999, Putin opened a memorial plaque to Andropov in deference and respect to him. And that same evening, he addressed a meeting, a gathering of KGB veterans in Moscow. And he told them, publicly, in front of cameras, with a smile on his face, he said, "I can report to you that a group of FSB officers assigned to work undercover in the government of the Russian Federation are fulfilling their mission." And everybody started clapping. And some people, I remember still, thought at the time that this was a quaint joke. Of course, now we know it was anything but that was the day. I think there were many others. I'm not saying this was the only thing. Of course, for a lot of people, it was the war in Chechnya that really showed who Mr. Putin was, and that was even before that. That was in the summer of 1999. But I just happen to remember that day really vividly, because Russia is a country of symbols. And if you basically begin your tenure by honoring somebody like Andropov, a symbol of Soviet totalitarian repression, that's not a very good sign for our upcoming administration.
We spend a little time in the film, or will spend a little time in the film, on Beslan and what happened there as another marker of something. Tell us that story.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to recall that the first victim of Vladimir Putin's regime was independent media. In fact, 4 days after he was inaugurated as president in May of 2000, 4 days after that, he sent armed operatives from the Prosecutor General Service and the tax police to raid the offices of Media Most, which was at the time the largest independent media holding in Russia, the parent company of NTV, the most popular independent television network in Russia that was known for its hard-hitting political analysis and satire and criticism of the authorities, including of Vladimir Putin himself. So within the first couple of years of his rule, Putin went after every nationwide independent television network, either shutting them down or taking them under state control, which is what happened with NTV. Then he shut down TV6, he shut down TVS in 2003. This was the last privately owned nationwide television channel that he closed. And of course it was very logical why he began with this, because a lot of the other things that he would go on to do would be impossible if you had a real independent media that would hold the regime and its actions to account. It would be much more difficult, for instance, to rig elections on the scale that Putin has been doing it if things were open and openly discussed in the media. It would be much more difficult to do what he did with Mikhail Khodorkovsky and the Yukos Oil Company, making this showcase that the business community should keep out of politics by imprisoning the richest man in Russia who dared to expose government corruption and support opposition parties and civil society groups. Something like this would have been much more difficult to do if you had all sides, represented in the public view. The corruption, the issue that we keep talking about in Russia, especially in the last several years, the absolutely mammoth, overwhelming corruption and nepotism that Putin's regime has created. Needless to say, that would have been more difficult had there been genuine independent media on a large scale, as there had been in Russia in the 1990s. And of course, the case of Beslan, I think, shows why it was so important for Putin to silence those independent media voices right at the beginning of his rule, because we can certainly not imagine that had there been real, genuine media coverage of the events in Beslan and the hostage crisis in Beslan, had there been a nationwide television network that would have honestly covered what was going on, I think it's impossible to imagine that the president of Russia could have given the order to attack, to storm a school where children were being held as hostages, and so many of these children were killed as a result of the decision he took. So I think it's in the context of the already solidified authoritarian, undemocratic regime, which had already been in place by the time the Beslan terrorist attack happened in September of 2004, that I think we have to look at the whole of this thing.
Then the act of essentially disbanding the governors as a further political consolidation of the power.
I'm a historian by training, so I always do try to find analogies, because most of these things have happened before. And I think the way Vladimir Putin consolidated his power in Russia in the early 2000s was very similar to the way Benito Mussolini consolidated his power in Italy in the early 20s. And Mussolini's advice was to pluck the chicken feather by feather to lessen the squawking. That's how he put it. So in other words, don't try to do it all in one day, all at the same time. Do it incrementally, gradually, carefully, step by step. This is how Mussolini did it, and this is how Putin did it. So Putin first went after independent media, independent television, and destroyed them. He then went after the opposition in parliament and after the electoral process, beginning to rig elections and booting out the democratic opposition from the Russian parliament in 2003, rendering parliament a rubber stamp for his initiatives. He then went after the business community with the case of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, with the imprisonment of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Russia's richest man, who had the tenacity to expose government corruption and support opposition parties in elections. And that was a clear message that don't do this. If you're going to do this, this is what's going to happen to you. As kind of a final step in the transformation of what was a flawed and problematic, but basically a democratic political system in Russia when Putin came to power, to a full-blown authoritarian regime that we have today. I think the last major step to that was after the Beslan terrorist attack, when Putin cynically used the terrorist attack, the hostage crisis, to abolish direct elections for regional governors in Russia, and to also change rules on parliamentary elections, after which the last remaining few independent lawmakers were thrown out of the Russian parliament. And parliament finally became, as its own speaker famously or infamously said, parliament's not a place for discussion. That's what Boris Gryzlov, Putin's party colleague from United Russia and former speaker of the Russian State Duma, said. I think that's going to be one of the quotes that defines the Putin era politically in Russia. Parliament is not a place for discussion. You can't put it any better than he did.
Let's talk about the things that worry him. 03, 04, 05, 06, the color revolutions. Help me just understand what's going on with him and why he fears his own population.
Well, a lot of this is actually a propaganda image created by Putin's state TV, this message that when people rise up to defend their rights and their freedoms and to protest against rigged elections, for example, that this is not the people themselves rising up. This is all instigated and manipulated from Washington, from the State Department, from God knows where. I mean, he's been saying these things openly. You remember when the mass protests broke out in Russia against Putin's rule at the end of 2011, after the rigged parliamentary elections of that year. Putin openly blamed it on the U.S. government, which was, I mean, absolutely mind-boggling. It shows you also, it opens up a little bit his paranoid KGB mindset, which shouldn't be surprising because that's what he was taught. That's what he did all of his life.
What was he taught? What's the KGB mindset?
Well, I mean, just think about it. I mean, we all have some kind of education and background and experience, and some people are, educated to be physicists or chemists or historians or mathematicians or economists. They all have things they learn, things they do, their own trade, their own knowledge, their own expertise. Well, what do you think they teach at the Andropov Institute of the KGB? They teach you to recruit, they teach you to lie, they teach you to subvert, they teach you to lead double lives. I mean, this is what this guy has done for his entire life, ever since he turned up at the door of the KGB directorate in Leningrad voluntarily after school to go to work for that organization. That also says a lot about someone who, in the 1970s, at the height of the totalitarian era, would openly volunteer to go and work for the KGB. So there's a lot of this mindset that he still shows very often. For instance, when he blames the mass protests on some foreign governments, some schemes. I mean, and that's actually another thing I think to do with his KGB mindset, that it's genuinely difficult for somebody like that to understand that not everything is manipulated and bought and purchased, and sometimes people are just genuinely fed up and they go out to the streets because that's the only way left for them to be heard, and they want to defend themselves and their dignity and their freedom. And he should have really got this message by now that it's possible. He's seen it in East Germany at the end of the 80s when he was stationed there. He saw it, of course, in Russia itself in 91, during our democratic revolution. He saw it again, very unpleasantly for him, in 2011 and 2012, during the largest opposition demonstrations under Putin's rule in Russia, when tens of thousands of people went to the streets across the country to protest against him. But you asked what are the things he's most afraid of, or most uncomfortable with. And I think there are only two things that Vladimir Putin is genuinely afraid of. The first is mass protests on the streets of Russia. That makes him really nervous. And for good reason, because he's seen what that can do to dictators and to corrupt strongmen in other countries, including former communist countries like Serbia, like Georgia, like Ukraine. He's seen where this can lead, and he's mortified of this. And you can see this reaction both in 2011 and 12, during the first wave of mass protest against the Putin regime, and now in 2017, since the start of this new protest movement at the beginning of this year, how nervous the regime has been about this, and how much of a crackdown they try to engage in against this peaceful opposition movement. So that's the first thing. And the second thing they're mortified of are individual targeted Western sanctions against officials and oligarchs in the Putin regime. Because we already talked about the many similarities that exist between the Putin regime and the Soviet regime. And there are very many similarities. I mean, we have political prisoners in Russia again today. We have no free and fair elections. We have censorship in the media, and so on and so forth. But for all these many similarities, political similarities, there's one important difference, crucial difference, in terms of the nature of the group of people and the regime in power. Because the Soviet Politburo, while members of the Soviet Politburo were jailing dissidents and muzzling independent opinions and putting people in prisons and psychiatric hospitals, they didn't keep their money in Western banks. They didn't send their children to study in Western schools. They didn't buy homes and yachts in Western countries. People in the Putin regime do that. They want to rule inside Russia like it's a third world dictatorship, denying people the basic rights and freedoms. But they themselves want to use the privileges and the freedoms and the opportunities of the Western world, of Western democracies, for themselves and for their families. So basically they want to steal in Russia and spend in the West. This is their modus vivendi. This is how these people live. And so when, beginning in 2012, with the Magnitsky Act being passed in the US Congress by overwhelming bipartisan majorities, with the West beginning to finally put an end to this impunity and finally beginning to hold these people accountable for what they do and what they have done, and declaring and laying down this principle, very simple principle really, that if you trample and abuse the most basic principles of the civilized world, you should not be allowed to enjoy the privileges that the civilized world has to offer. And it really is not a complicated principle. It's very simple, and it's also the right thing to do. So since the West has finally begun to do this, in many ways because of the efforts of Russian opposition leaders like Boris Nemtsov, who was instrumental in convincing the US Congress to pass the Magnitsky Act, over opposition from the Obama administration, by the way. This really was a nightmare for Putin's Kremlin. And we have seen all the efforts that Putin's Kremlin has engaged in over the last several years to try to stop and undermine and overturn this process of introducing targeted personal sanctions. He did it both officially and unofficially. Just a few hours after his inauguration in May of 2012, for his current presidential term, he signed an official order to the Foreign Ministry of Russia, tasking it with trying to stop the Magnitsky Act. This was put on paper as official Russian presidential policy. He has also engaged in blackmail to try to undermine the Magnitsky Act by linking it to continued adoptions of Russian orphans by US citizens. Absolutely mind-boggling if you think about it. So Putin retaliated for targeted individual sanctions on human rights abusers who are prevented from doing their Christmas shopping on New York's Fifth Avenue by denying Russian orphans, Russian kids, many of them disabled Russian kids, basically a chance in life, saying you let them rot in horrible conditions in Russian orphanages, and I'm going to ban their adoptions by U.S. citizens because the U.S. has banned our human rights abusers from going there. If you need a moral portrait of the Putin regime, that's the best example. As prominent Russian columnist Valery Panyushkin said at the time, there are only two organizations in the world that use their own children as human shield against their enemies. One is Hamas, and the other one is United Russia Party, led by Vladimir Putin. And of course, all these stories that we keep hearing just in the last few days about the meeting in Trump Tower in June of 2016, I think a lot of people are discussing, all the other aspects of this meeting, but not enough attention is paid to the actual substance of it. The reason it took place is because these two unofficial proxies acting for Putin's regime, for the Kremlin, they tried to secure this meeting in order to try to undermine and overturn the Magnitsky Act. This has been absolutely central. So the two biggest fears, biggest nightmares of the Putin regime are mass protests on the streets of Russia, mass protests by the people of Russia against his regime, which we're increasingly seeing again since the beginning of this year, and I think we'll see only more of in the coming months and years. And the second one is those targeted personal individual sanctions against crooks and human rights abusers in Putin regime. Personal, this is very important. Not sanctions on Russia. An entire country should not be blamed for the actions of a small, unelected group of people in the Kremlin. Responsibility should be assigned where it is due, to those people who actually perpetrate these abuses. And this is why the Magnitsky Act was so groundbreaking. It introduced this concept that you can sanction not a whole country, not even the government of that country, but you can actually sanction those specific people who are engaged in those abuses and in that corruption and in those human rights violations. And that was very honorable and principled, as well as very effective.
Explain his response to Hillary's statements that the election had been, rigged and people should hit the streets. How could he? What is his reaction to that?
Well, I think again this goes to this whole mindset of trying to see conspiracies everywhere, and this paranoid idea that everything that happens, there are some secret masterminds standing behind it. I mean, he cannot accept the idea that so many people in Russia are fed up with his rule, are unhappy about his rule, that they're fed up with being treated like a doormat, that they want to be citizens of their own country as opposed to voiceless subjects, and that people can actually be unhappy about their votes being stolen and the elections being rigged. This is what happened in 2011. Let's just first of all just talk about this. I mean, what happened in 2011 was an absolutely blatant and brazen rigging of a parliamentary election. This was not the first time a Russian election was rigged. This happened many times under Putin. But this was the first time this was done so openly and brazenly and unashamedly. And they didn't even basically try to deny it. And because this was already the age of the internet and social media, all this information and these videos and photos of ballot stuffing and rewriting of vote tallies, they just spread in a matter of hours. And just a few days after that election, more than 100,000 people came out to the center of Moscow, just across the river from the Kremlin on Bolotnaya Square, to say, no, enough. We are fed up with this. And this was the largest demonstration held in Russia, in Moscow, since the Democratic Revolution of August 1991. It was followed by an even larger one on Andrei Sakharov Avenue just a few days later, and at the end of December 2011. And of course, Putin was terrified, and his regime was terrified, and they responded initially by quickly issuing some political concessions to the protesters, like, for instance, reinstating direct elections for regional governors that they had abolished after the terrorist attack in Beslan. Remember, in 2010, Dmitry Medvedev, who was then caretaker president, taking Putin's place while he was constitutionally barred from serving as president for a term, Medvedev said publicly that he was asked, when the Russian government is going to reinstate direct elections for regional governors, and he said, not in 100 years. And of course, a year after that, when 100,000 people went out to the streets of Moscow and stood across the river from the Kremlin, it took them a few days to reinstate direct elections for governors. And they did a few other small things, like they registered a couple of opposition parties, they released a few political prisoners, so they hurriedly began issuing some concessions. And then, of course, they went into a crackdown mode, and they began arresting people and trying people, including opposition activists and opposition leaders, and there are still people sitting in prisons today, more than 5 years after those protests, for taking part in those protests on Bolotnaya Square. And of course, he began to blame the West and Western governments, and in particular the US administration, for instigating those protests and standing behind them. I mean, this is a continuation of the same line they'd used with regard to the so-called color revolutions in other post-communist countries like Serbia, like Georgia, like Ukraine. Was the message, the propaganda message, that this was all done by, Western puppet masters, to try to get at him, at Putin. And so, of course, this was the message he repeated with regard to the Russian protests in Moscow and other cities in Russia in 2011 and 12. And when Hillary Clinton made that statement, I mean, first of all, she didn't say anything particularly revolutionary. She just repeated what the observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe had stated. And that was that this election was not free, not fair, not democratic. This was just stating a basic fact. There was nothing really groundbreaking about this. She just honestly said, what the OSCE observers had concluded. And of course, Putin was furious, and the Kremlin was furious. They said this is interference in our internal affairs, and so on and so forth. A favorite phrase, by the way, that they use, despite the fact that this phrase is a lie, because Russia is a full member of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, as is the United States, as is every country in the European Union. And the rules of that organization and the statutes of that organization clearly state, black and white, that matters relating to the rule of law, to human rights, and to democracy, including election standards, cannot be considered internal affairs. They're subject to international obligations and international concern. So when Vladimir Putin or Sergei Lavrov are saying that these are interferences into internal affairs, they are, how should I say most diplomatically, they are misspeaking. But this is what he did. This was his reaction. Again, there's nothing particularly new about this. This is what he does when he's under siege politically. He begins blaming people for his problems. So instead of just admitting and accepting that there are increasing numbers of Russian people who are unhappy and fed up with his rule and are beginning to protest against him, he's saying that these are all conspiracies masterminded by some governments in the West. Pretty ironic, actually, with regard to the Obama administration, because the Obama administration being the one who had declared a reset in relations with the Putin regime. President Obama had praised Putin publicly as somebody who's done tremendous work on behalf of the Russian people, and Hillary Clinton was the one who pressed the reset button. So, by the way, there's also a very important lesson, I think, in all of this. Both previous U.S. presidents, I mean, technically Bill Clinton was the first president who coincided with Putin, but he was only there, he was basically a lame duck by then, it was his last year, so he didn't really have a chance to do much. But both U.S. presidents who kind of had their full terms under Vladimir Putin, George W. Bush and Barack Obama, tried to be friendly with him, as we well know. We remember George W. Bush looking into Putin's eyes and getting a sense of his soul and praising Putin as a true reformer. We remember Barack Obama declaring a reset in relations with the Putin regime and praising Putin again as somebody who's done tremendous work on behalf of the Russian people. This is very naive and not very wise and farsighted to try to have a friendly relationship with a corrupt authoritarian regime. There cannot be a convergence of interest or even a real, relationship based on mutual trust and mutual understanding between, on the one hand, a constitutional democracy, that is the United States, and a corrupt authoritarian dictatorship, that is Vladimir Putin's regime. And if history teaches us anything, is that making short-term, cynical deals with authoritarian governments is not a good strategy for a democratic nation. And I think both George W. Bush and Barack Obama found this the hard way.
One of the moments that we spent some time on surrounds the events in the Crimea and Ukraine, assessing in some ways Obama's government's arguments, internal arguments about whether they should arm the Ukrainians against the onslaught of the Russian troops, whether Obama should have confronted more forcefully with at least lethal defensive weapons Putin's taking of Crimea and initiation of conflict. The argument inside the American government, forcefully made by Toria Nuland and many others, was we have to draw the line somewhere, and this should be a great human rights place to draw the line. Let's do it, because somebody has to draw the line and face him. What is your sense of how Putin would have reacted if Obama would have been forceful?
You know what, I think probably 2014 was a little bit late for trying to draw the line against Vladimir Putin. When Vladimir Putin came to power at the end of 1999, the beginning of 2000, he tried to tread very carefully at first. He was testing both Russian public opinion and international public opinion, and the views of Western leaders and Western governments to what he was doing and the reaction to what he was doing. And there was no reaction. When he went after and shut down and destroyed independent national television networks in Russia, there was no reaction. In fact, just a few weeks after the Putin government seized control of NTV, the largest independent TV channel in Russia, he was, he had that famous summit meeting with George W. Bush when he looked into his eyes and got a sense of his soul. This was a few weeks after the takeover of NTV. And 2 days after the Putin government pulled the plug on the last independent nationwide television network in Russia, TVS, in June of 2003. 2 days after that, Putin was treated to a royal reception, literally, at the London Guildhall with the Queen of England and with Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister. He was praised, and it was all pomp and circumstance. And I think he could be forgiven for getting the wrong message, that Western leaders really didn't care about this. And one thing to understand about how Russian political history works and how Russian political dynamics work, certainly in the modern era, is that there is a direct correlation between the domestic nature of the regime and the way it behaves abroad, the way it behaves outside of Russian borders. So domestic repression is inevitably followed sooner or later by external aggression. And this is absolutely logical if you think about it. I mean, what's the reason for expecting a government that violates the rights of its own people and that breaks its own laws, why would you expect it to then abide by international norms and respect the interests of other countries or international borders? So as Putin grew bolder and bolder and consolidated his control domestically, and as he basically saw no reaction from the international community over his crackdown on independence of the media, over his crackdown on parliament and his rigging of elections, and the Yukos case, and the abolition of regional governors, and this authoritarian consolidation at home, he grew bolder and bolder and more assertive, and he thought, as again he could be forgiven for doing, why not go on? And why not do even more things? And I think those people, those political leaders in Western countries who had chosen to ignore the crackdown on independence of the media and the rigging of elections and the destruction of democratic institutions in Russia, they woke up one day to see a violation of international borders in Europe, to see the first territorial annexation in Europe since the Second World War, which is what Putin did in Crimea in 2014. These are all directly linked. And I think had the international community and had the leaders of Western democracies taken a more principled stand earlier on in Putin's rule, instead of praising him and try to engage him and be friendly with him as he was destroying democracy in Russia, I think had they taken a more principled line earlier on, we would not be seeing the excesses that we are seeing today, including violations of international borders.
So it was too late for Obama to step up by then. Is that what you're saying?
I think it. Well, I think if we're talking about drawing the lines against the Putin regime, there have been so many lines that failed to be drawn after 2000. I mean, I'm not saying that if you didn't begin to draw lines at the beginning, you should just go on not drawing them. I'm not saying that. But I'm just wondering how effective it would be to begin drawing a line against an aggressive dictator in the 15th year of him being in power.
It also seems, we haven't talked at all about this, but it seems that Putin, the former KGB man and asymmetrical warrior, was equipped by 2014, 2015, in there around Ukraine with what has been called hybrid warfare tactics and capabilities, from hard power to cyber power to information war, and it looks almost to us like what Ukraine is a road test for that kind of warfare.
That also has a long history. I mean, the KGB, Mr. Putin's alma mater, professional alma mater, has been involved in so-called active measures for years and decades. I mean, the Soviet Union, the Soviet regime, is not just engaged in actual physical war. They've done a lot of the clandestine stuff and active measures against their opponents or perceived opponents. So I think that's certainly true, what you're saying. There's nothing new in this too. And in terms of Ukraine, I think it's also important to note the fact that the main motivation for Putin's aggression against Ukraine that began in 2014 was not geopolitical or post-imperialist or foreign policy driven. It was domestic. He really didn't enjoy the precedent of a corrupt, authoritarian strongman in a country so close to Russia, culturally, historically, linguistically, you name it, as Ukraine is, being overthrown by a popular uprising, by a popular democratic revolution. He really didn't like those images of Mr. Yanukovych hastily boarding his helicopter in Kharkiv to flee, as hundreds of thousands of people are demonstrating on the streets of the capital. And I think his overreaching goal behind his aggression against Ukraine in 2014 was to try to prevent the success of the democratic European experiment in Ukraine, to try to crush the Maidan in Kiev before it will become a model and an inspiration for a Maidan in Moscow. This is why he has done and continues to do what he does, I think, against Ukraine. So it is, in a way, it's a what Putin's doing in Ukraine is a proxy war against Russian society, and trying to prevent the same political developments that had happened in Ukraine.
It's interesting, very interesting. Let's go to the American election in 2016. When you first heard about the allegations that it was Russia meddling in our election, what did you think?
I thought, first of all, let's be accurate with the terms. Not Russia, but the Putin regime,
Okay,
and the Russian
the
officials
Kremlin,
and Russian
whatever you
government.
want to call it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was not at all surprised because the Putin regime has had a long history of meddling in elections. First of all, of course, in Russian elections. This is how they began. One of the first targets of the Putin regime has been the electoral process in Russia, and since he came to power all those years ago, we have not had a free and fair and democratic national election in Russia. Not one. And this is not me saying it. This is according to the reports from international monitors. So he's been meddling with the Russian electoral process for years. He has been meddling in the electoral process in other countries for years. And we know all of this. I mean, look at what they've been doing in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Moldova, in other countries. And since he's been doing it, again, with almost no reaction, really, including from the international community, then, in his logic, in a dictator's logic, why not continue doing it? And why not go for the gold, as it were, and try to do in the U.S. what he's done before in Ukraine and Georgia?
Tell me about the death of Boris Nemtsov, what you think happened, where it fits into this larger story we've been discussing.
Well, in terms of the larger story, we know that there's been a very high mortality rate in the last several years among the people who have crossed the path of Vladimir Putin's Kremlin. Independent journalists, anti-corruption campaigners, opposition activists, opposition leaders. Many people have died. Some in strange and unexplained deaths, others in just straight-out assassinations. And the assassination of Boris Nemtsov was the most brazen, the most high-profile political assassination in modern Russia. And the political responsibility for this lies squarely with Vladimir Putin and his regime. When the leader of the opposition is assassinated in the shadow of the Kremlin, just 200 yards from a Kremlin wall, in what is probably the most well-guarded and secure location, not just in Moscow, but probably in the whole of Europe. The political responsibility for this lies with the regime, with the atmosphere that is created over the years, including with its propaganda, where political opponents of Mr. Putin are vilified and denounced as traitors and foreign agents and enemies of Russia. And of course, Boris Nemtsov was the most prominent political opponent of Vladimir Putin. He was the strongest political opponent of Vladimir Putin. He was unique in so many ways. First of all, he had a very rare combination in today's Russian politics, that he had government experience, successful government experience, because he's been a regional governor, a very successful one in the 90s. He worked in the federal government as deputy prime minister. He was a member of parliament, leader of the parliamentary opposition. On the one hand, on the other hand, he had a very good reputation and background. He never worked for the Putin regime. He spent years defending democracy and rule of law in Russia, when he could have easily chosen to do something easier, like so many other people have. So many people who were thought of as Democrats and liberals in Russia back in the 90s, when Putin came to power and began doing what he was doing, they settled for the easy and comfortable option, either finding a place in the regime, or in structures close to the regime, or in big business, or in the worst case, leaving the country and settling in the safety of exile. Boris Nemtsov didn't do that. He chose to stay and fight for his country and for the future of his country against a kleptocratic, authoritarian regime that he saw as destroying the future of Russia. And he gave his all to this. And he was He was the strongest and the best of all of us. He was an amazing communicator. I spent I worked with him, alongside him, for more than 15 years. I've seen him in many different situations. I can tell you I've not seen anybody like this. He could speak on the same level and with the same effectiveness to American and European parliamentarians and ministers, and to a local saleswoman in a market in the Yaroslavl region. On the same level, with the same effectiveness. He could come into a room with 500 people, and you could feel the tension in the air. And you could feel that most of those people were hostile to him. Not surprising, given all this propaganda that's been pushed out on state TV for years against him. And when he would speak to those people for an hour, for 2 hours, for 3 hours, taking questions, arguing back, talking, explaining his position, after he was done, 2/3 of the audience was on his side. I've never seen this with anyone. He is the only leader of the so-called non-systemic opposition in Russia who managed to win an election in Russia under Vladimir Putin. This is impossible. Nobody else has managed to do this. Boris Nemtsov won. In 2013, he was elected as a lawmaker in the Yaroslavl region. And at the same time, as we already discussed with you, he was instrumental in convincing the US Congress to pass the Magnitsky Act, those targeted individual sanctions against Putin's regime and its human rights abuses. Senator John McCain, one of the chief authors of the Magnitsky Act, has said publicly on record that there would not be a Magnitsky Act without Boris Nemtsov. So he was the strongest and the most prominent political opponent that Vladimir Putin and his regime had. And they were afraid of him.
And his murder was a message? Sent a message?
Well, I mean, it's not so much a message, it's just depriving the opposition of its strongest, most prominent, and most effective leader. It's depriving Russia of, I think, the best president we could have had. And, of course, Boris Nemtsov had plans to run in the presidential election in 2018. He was elected in 2013 as a lawmaker in Yaroslavl. He was planning to run for the national parliament in Russia, for the State Duma in 2016. And even with all the fraud and the rigging, just because of who he was and how he would communicate with people and how he would work with people, he had a good chance of actually winning. And now, as we're speaking with you, he could have been back in the national parliament of Russia, and that would have just given him a completely different status. So, I mean, because you asked me this question, I'm trying to answer it the best I can, but I find it really difficult to actually talk about this in political analysis terms. This is personal for me. Boris Nemtsov was my closest friend. He's godfather to my younger daughter. That's family in Russia. And I know that for so many people, this is personal. And we're not going to forget, by the way. And I have no doubt that one day, those people who are behind his assassination, not just the perpetrators who have just been sentenced to prison, but also the organizers and the masterminds, those who organized and ordered this, that these people will face justice according to the Russian law. They will be held responsible under the law. I have no doubt about this.
And what happened to you?
If you read my official discharge papers from Moscow hospital, it was toxic action by an unidentified substance. That's the official diagnosis. So translated from medical into human language, poisoning. They don't know with what. They're not sure how this was done. But the only thing we know is that twice in 2 years, the first in May of 2015 and the second time in February of 2017, I felt suddenly and violently ill, both times in Moscow. Both times falling into a coma with multiple organ failure and with a 5% chance to survive. This is what doctors told my wife, both in 2015 and 2017. And it's only by the grace of God and by the work of the good doctors in Moscow that I'm sitting here and speaking with you today. And I'm certainly very grateful and certainly very fortunate. I have no doubt that this was an attempt to kill. If it's a 5% chance to survive, that's not how you send a message. That's how you try to kill someone. And then I have no doubt that this was a response to my political activities in the Russian opposition. I think more specifically in response to my work on the Magnitsky Act and the support and the participation in this process of the imposition of individual targeted Western sanctions against human rights abuses in the Putin regime. I've been involved in this process together with Boris Nemtsov and now without him for many years now. And I will continue to do this, by the way, because I think this is very important. This is, as we discussed with you before, this is one of only two things that really worry Vladimir Putin's regime.
How is it viewed in Russia now? What did he win out of his being involved in the U.S. election?
Mm-hmm. The goal of the meetings the Kremlin proxies tried to set up with Trump campaign officials was to undermine and overturn the Magnitsky Act. This is an overriding priority for them. It's also mind-boggling in a way if you think about that the unofficial foreign policy priority of the Russian state and an official task of diplomats and the Foreign Service is to overturn personal sanctions against crooks and human rights abusers. This is actually insulting for Russian diplomats and for the Russian Foreign Service, that they've been put at the service of the crooks and human rights abusers trying to gain their personal privileges back. But this is what Putin has been doing. And I think if we ask what the goal was of his presumed interference in the U.S. electoral process, is to try to get the Magnitsky Law overturned, repealed, or at least not implemented properly. So I think, actually, and including for those people who are concerned about all of this from the U.S. political standpoint, I think it's crucial to watch how the Magnitsky Act continues to be implemented. The current Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, during his Senate confirmation hearings in January of 2017, was asked publicly on the record whether the administration will continue to enforce the Magnitsky Act and put out new names in the sanctions lists. And he publicly said yes, the administration will continue to enforce Magnitsky Act and add new names. So let us see how this act is enforced and how the new names are added. So far, there's not been a single new name added under the Magnitsky Act. This, by the way, is nothing new either, because the Obama administration has been very timid in implementing this law. They were against it in the first place. They didn't want it to happen. When it did happen, when it was passed with huge, overwhelming bipartisan majorities in both houses of Congress, not something that happens very often in this town, as I understand. Once this became law, they had to implement it, but they were really timid about it. And for the first 4 years, they were putting just some really low-level people until their last 2 weeks in office. In its last 2 weeks, the Obama administration added the most high-profile person so far to this list, the top law enforcement official in Putin's regime, General Alexander Bastrykin, head of the investigative committee of the Russian Federation, Putin's old university friend. The man who is responsible for all the politically motivated prosecutions in recent years in Russia against opposition activists and leaders. The man who once personally took an independent journalist to a forest outside of Moscow. This is a top law enforcement official in Putin regime, a general. He personally drove a journalist to a forest and threatened to kill him if his newspaper continued with the investigations. And attempted a joke saying, haha, by the way, I'll be the one in charge of the investigation of your murder, so don't worry about this. And this is not in dispute, by the way. This is not alleged or supposed. He admitted this. He also said he was sorry afterwards. But I don't think that's frankly enough. And this guy was put on the Magnitsky list in January of 2017. But for years before that, the Obama administration had been very timid about implementing it. This administration so far has not added a single new name to the Magnitsky list. Let's see how it continues to be implemented. I think this is going to be the key criterion to judge all of these things on. And so your question of what did Putin get out of trying to do what he did? Well, if the Magnitsky Act stops working, then Putin will have got what he wanted.
And Putin's view of Trump, how do you think he views Trump through the campaign and now that he's president?
I think for Putin, it's not about people and personalities. It's about how he can use circumstance and situation to his own benefit and for his own ends. And I don't think it's anything personal for him. His goal was to create, I think, circumstances and the situation politically in the US where he would be able to advance his own goals and his regime's goals. And chief among that is to undermine and get rid of the Magnitsky Act. So I don't think it's necessarily a personal thing that, you know, he wanted to help a particular person or he wanted to prevent a particular person. He's very cynical about this. Just as they say in movies about mafia, it's nothing personal, strictly business. I think that's his attitude.
And isn't it possible he was motivated by a belief that America's democracy is manipulated just like he manipulates Russian democracy? That everybody does it, that all television is ordered from the top, that all journalism is Kazny and so on. I mean, isn't it possible he wanted to create kind of parallel universe and just create chaos in America?
If you look and analyze what Putin's propaganda has been doing, I think they've long stopped pretending that this regime is so good and great and beneficial for the Russian people. Their message is that, first of all, that all the others are even worse, and secondly, that everybody does it across the world too, and that there's no such thing as real democracy. There's no such thing as genuine media freedom. There's no such thing as real elections, and everywhere is manipulated. And if it were possible to create doubts and to create chaos with the political system of a major Western democratic country like the US, I think that will certainly serve the propaganda goals of Vladimir Putin's regime. So this may indeed be another aspect of this. And if you look at the coverage in Kremlin-controlled media of elections, not just the US election in 2016, but also other elections, the recent French election, the upcoming elections in Germany, that has been the message. That, yeah, everywhere is like this. Everywhere there's administrative resource. Everywhere there's no real media freedom. And everywhere the elections are manipulated and controlled and achieve the result that the current whoever's in government wants. I mean, needless to say, I mean, I'm stating the completely obvious here, but needless to say that flies in the face of the facts. Just beginning with the simple fact that so many people who have been in power have actually lost elections in Western countries. This has never yet happened in Russia. Just think about this. Throughout the whole of the history of Russia, there has never been a ruler who has lost an election, or at least lost an election to an extent that he then lost power. Boris Yeltsin, when he was president, he lost a lot of parliamentary elections, so he had actually an opposition majority in parliament for the duration of his presidency. Parliament was a real thing in Yeltsin's Russia, unlike today. But he still stayed in power. So there was not a single election in Russian history when the ruler, the incumbent, lost power as a result of an election. Just think about this.
Good, thank you very much.